When you watch like a controlled demolition of a massive skyscraper, it's really all about precision. Like the engineers spend months calculating the exact placement of the explosives.
Right. They analyze the load-bearing walls, map out the surrounding infrastructure.
Exactly. And they meticulously plan the collapse so it doesn't take down the rest of the city block with it.
Yeah, it's highly calculated, methodical, and above all, it's paced. I mean, you don't rush gravity. You let the structure come down on your schedule, ensuring everything around it remains intact.
Right. It's organized destruction. But imagine if that same engineering crew was suddenly told by management, you have 5 minutes, do it now.
Oh, well, the precision goes entirely out the window at that point.
Yeah, you're just ripping out structural supports and hoping for the best. All while half the occupants are somehow still inside the building and the surrounding streets haven't even been cleared.
It goes from a controlled demolition to an absolute catastrophe in the blink of an eye.
And that terrifying scenario is exactly what we are looking at today when we examine the end of the British Raj in 1947. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
Our mission today is to explore the end of a colonial empire that ruled the Indian subcontinent for 150 years. But we are looking way beyond the standard history book dates. We want to uncover the secret strategic calculations behind the British withdrawal, the sudden termination of paramountcy, and the highly controversial roles of transitional British officers.
And to do this, we are pulling from a truly fascinating stack of sources. We've got historical texts, newly declassified British archives, geopolitical analyses from the IDSA, which is a prominent Indian defense think tank, and some really incredible first-hand accounts, including a retrospective interview with the man who actually drew the borders, Sir Cyril Radcliffe.
We are going to break down this massive geopolitical earthquake into clear, digestible insights for you. Okay, let's unpack this. How did an empire that ruled for a century and a half pack up and leave in a matter of weeks? And what were the secret motives driving that incredibly frantic timeline?
Well, to understand the end of the Raj, you first have to look at the shifting timeline, because behind closed doors, the British knew they had to leave. I mean, the writing was on the wall.
Right.
But the when and the why changed drastically over a very short period. So after World War II, Britain was completely exhausted.
Yeah.
They were facing a severe manpower shortage back home. They desperately needed their young men back in factories and rebuilding bombed-out cities, not policing a restless subcontinent.
And they were flat broke, right? Like, the sources show Britain actually owed a staggering 1,200 million pounds in debt to India. They went from being India's creditor to its debtor over the course of the war.
Precisely. And their administrative grip was slipping fast. The famous steel frame of the Indian civil service, the bureaucracy that literally ran the day-to-day operations of the subcontinent, it was down to just 500 British officers.
Wow. 500.
Yeah, we're talking about 500 men trying to manage the administration, tax collection, and law enforcement for hundreds of millions of people across a landmass the size of Europe.
That's just wild.
Right, and the military balance had shifted too. So the viceroy at the time, Lord Wavell, came up with what he called the breakdown plan.
The breakdown plan, which actually sounds a lot like that slow, methodical demolition we were talking about earlier.
Exactly, it was heavily phased. Wavell envisioned an orderly withdrawal by spring 1948. He proposed starting the evacuation from the southern Hindu-majority provinces where the British presence was less vital for immediate security, consolidating British personnel in the north, and then slowly handing over power step by step.
But Whitehall, so the British government in London, they completely rejected Wavell's plan, didn't they?
They did. They thought a phased withdrawal looked like a retreat under fire. They literally called it a scuttle that would result in a complete loss of their global prestige and influence.
So they fired Wavell?
Yep. They fired him and brought in Lord Louis Mountbatten. And Mountbatten executes the June 3 plan, which accelerates independence to August 15th, 1947.
Which is 10 months earlier than originally planned.
Yeah. And this is where the hidden strategic calculus comes in. Like, why the sudden rush? And why agree to partition the subcontinent into two nations, India and Pakistan, rather than handing it over united?
I mean, they must have had a reason.
Declassified archives and IDSA analyses reveal that the overarching British strategic goal wasn't just about leaving. It was about securing a post-colonial defense alliance.
Because the Cold War was just starting to cast its shadow and the whole geopolitical chessboard was being reset.
Exactly. Britain was terrified of the Soviet Union expanding southward. They needed to protect Middle Eastern oil fields and the Indian Ocean sea routes. The British Chiefs of Staff concluded that keeping a military foothold in South Asia was just absolutely non-negotiable.
So they rushed the exit.
Right. They rushed it and accepted partition primarily to ensure that both new nations would remain within the British Commonwealth. But they were especially focused on a strategically positioned Pakistan, which bordered the vital northwest frontier, serving as a buffer against Soviet expansion.
Hold on. I need to push back on that logic for a second, because it doesn't quite track for me. If Britain is entirely broke, owing over £1 billion, and has an administrative force of just 500 officers left to maintain order for an entire subcontinent,
Yeah.
how on earth are they still trying to play 4D chess with global defense strategies? Like, it sounds like a bankrupt CEO trying to dictate the board's future 10-year strategy while actively being evicted from the building by security.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture and take that CEO analogy a step further, the board in London viewed this eviction merely as a tactical retreat.
A tactical retreat.
Yeah. Yes, they were losing direct administrative control of the building, but retaining military and geopolitical influence over the neighborhood was paramount. For London, securing Commonwealth defense partners against the Soviets trumped local administrative stability.
Wow.
They believed if they left quickly and decisively on their own terms, they could essentially force India and Pakistan to rely on British military structures moving forward.
So they prioritized global Cold War strategy over the local, on-the-ground reality, which directly causes Mountbatten to push the exit date forward to August 1947 to lock in that Commonwealth status before the whole region devolves into a civil war that might invite Soviet interference.
You've got it.
But that incredibly tight deadline meant the actual mechanics of dividing the country had to be done at breakneck speed, which leads us to the terrifying reality of drawing the borders.
Yeah, this brings us to Sir Cyril Radcliffe. Mountbatten tasked this London barrister with drawing the borders for 88 million people across 450,000 square kilometers of territory.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because Radcliffe's qualifications for this monumental task were virtually non-existent. Like, the man had never traveled east of Paris.
No.
He had zero cartographic experience. He didn't know the culture, the geography, or the complex agricultural realities of the land he was about to literally slice in half.
And yet, Mountbatten chose him specifically because this total ignorance of India was somehow viewed as being unbiased.
It's a staggering historical detail. Like, the British establishment genuinely believed that a complete lack of context equated to perfect judicial neutrality.
Right. So Radcliffe arrived in July 1947 and was given just 5 weeks to divide a subcontinent. And the constraints he worked under were impossible. I mean, he was suffering from severe dysentery in the sweltering heat of the Indian summer.
That sounds awful.
A physical field survey was deemed completely impossible because of the climate and that relentlessly ticking clock.
So what does he use? The sources say he was using outdated maps, like some of them just based on local tax collection routes.
Yeah, that's all he had.
It's like being asked to perform a complex, life-saving surgery using a butter knife and a 10-year-old anatomy textbook, all while a stopwatch ticks down from 5 minutes.
That captures the sheer recklessness of the endeavor perfectly. Radcliffe was presiding over 2 boundary commissions, one for Punjab in the west and one for Bengal in the east. He was slicing right through complex, interdependent ecosystems.
He was cutting irrigation canals off from the rivers that fed them.
Exactly. Separating farmers from their ancestral fields and factory workers from their factories.
And the political manipulation behind the scenes was intense. I mean, the maps weren't just messy, they were being actively contested. For example, there was a massive controversy over the switching of the Firozpur and Zira tehsils in Punjab.
Yes. For context, a tehsil is essentially a local administrative division, like a county district.
Right, and these were Muslim-majority districts that were initially slated to go to Pakistan, but they were mysteriously switched to India at the very last minute before the final boundary award was announced.
Yeah, it remains one of the most fiercely debated aspects of the partition. And then there is the awarding of the Gurdaspur district to India.
Which was huge.
Highly controversial. Because giving Gurdaspur to India wasn't just about the local population, it provided India with a crucial physical land bridge to the state of Kashmir.
And without Gurdaspur, India's access to Kashmir would have been severely restricted.
Yeah,
which profoundly altered the geopolitical future of the entire region.
definitely.
The human toll of this rushed line on a map was just devastating.
Right.
Radcliffe himself was completely isolated in a mansion, surrounded by guards, terrified of assassination.
And when the borders were finally announced, the resulting violence and chaos were so horrific that he burned all his working papers.
He just burned them.
Yeah, he wanted no record left behind of how he made these agonizing choices. He refused to accept his 40,000 rupee fee, and he left India on August 15th, the very day of independence, vowing never to return.
The tragedy of his haste and his isolation was famously captured by the poet W.H. Auden in his poem Partition. He wrote, unbiased at least he was when he arrived on his mission. Having never set eyes on this land, he was called to partition. Shut up in a lonely mansion, with police night and day patrolling the gardens to keep assassins away. But in 7 weeks it was done, the frontiers decided. A continent for better or worse divided.
It's haunting.
It gives you chills. But while Radcliffe was carving up British-ruled provinces with his metaphorical butter knife, there was another massive problem looming. Like, what do you do with the parts of the subcontinent the British didn't directly own?
Ah, so you're talking about paramountcy.
Right.
To understand this, we have to look at how the British Empire actually functioned on the ground. Because while the British directly ruled the major provinces, there were 562 princely states scattered across the map.
Wow, 562.
Yeah. These ranged from the massive, wealthy state of Hyderabad, which was literally the size of Italy, down to tiny kingdoms that were basically just a few dozen villages.
And it's important to understand why these existed. The British didn't want to spend the money and the troops to directly conquer and govern every square inch of the subcontinent. That would have been an administrative nightmare. So they used almost a franchise model. They made treaties with these local kings and princes.
Exactly. Through treaties, the British held paramountcy. That meant the British crown controlled the defense, foreign affairs, and communications of these states. But the princes were allowed to rule their internal territories and populations as they saw fit. It was a cost-saving vassal system that kept ultimate control in London.
But the Indian Independence Act in 1947 terminated that relationship entirely. The franchise agreements were shredded. Legally speaking, on August 15, 1947, all 562 of these princes became independent, sovereign monarchs.
Well, technically and legally, yes. However, both the British and the new dominions of India and Pakistan were terrified of the balkanization of the subcontinent.
Oh, for sure.
Imagine 562 independent countries suddenly springing up inside the borders of India and Pakistan, each with their own laws, potentially their own militaries, and the ability to sign treaties with foreign powers. I mean, it would be an absolute geopolitical nightmare.
So Mountbatten, acting as the crown representative, took it upon himself to actively pressure the princes to sign instruments of accession to either India or Pakistan, primarily based on their geographic location.
And he used every tool of persuasion and coercion available to him. He was a real master of political theater.
The sources describe him wearing his full, gleaming royal uniform, absolutely covered in military medals, using his status as an actual member of the British royal family to intimidate and dazzle these princes. He basically cornered them into signing away their newly granted independence.
Take the state of Travancore in the south, for instance. They possessed valuable resources, including uranium, and they firmly wanted to remain an independent nation.
Right.
But they suddenly faced a coordinated campaign of direct action from political groups. Violence flared up, their prime minister was attacked, and Mountbatten directly pressured him into conceding that the only path to stability was to join India.
But isn't that a massive historical paradox?
Yeah.
Like, the Independence Act explicitly stated that these states were legally free. Wasn't Mountbatten essentially violating the spirit of his own government's legislation by strong-arming them into giving up that freedom?
It is a paradox, yes. Mountbatten is technically enforcing the law by ending British paramountcy, but simultaneously preventing the very independence that law created, all in the name of ensuring regional stability for his Cold War defense strategy.
Unbelievable.
And nowhere was this paradox more fraught than in Kashmir. Kashmir was a unique strategic anomaly. It had a Hindu ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, but an overwhelmingly Muslim population, and it sat right on the highly sensitive border with Pakistan.
Mountbatten actually visited Kashmir before the transition, didn't he? He urged the Maharaja not to declare independence, but to ascertain the will of his people before the transfer of power. to make a clear choice one way or the other.
Yes, but the Maharaja delayed. He wanted to hold out for independence. And because he didn't integrate with either dominion before the August deadline, it created a massive power vacuum immediately after independence.
Right.
This led to an invasion by tribal militias from Pakistan, the hurried accession of Kashmir to India, and the First Indo-Pakistani War. It's a conflict that remains unresolved today. So Mountbatten's prioritization of a quick, seamless map over the complex demographic realities on the ground had a phenomenally heavy cost.
Okay, so the political maps are drawn hastily, and the 562 princes were wrangled, mostly. But the actual machinery of the state still had to be split. You have a unified army, unified finances, a unified civil service. How do you divide a functioning military while it's still operating?
Oh, it was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. To manage this, they created the Partition Council and the Joint Defense Council. Now, it's vital to note here that Mountbatten managed to stay on as the Governor-General of independent India, while Muhammad Ali Jinnah insisted on taking the Governor-General role for Pakistan himself.
Which created an incredibly weird dynamic. I mean, Mountbatten is supposed to be this neutral, overarching figurehead overseeing the fair division of assets between the two countries, but he's simultaneously serving as the head of state for one of those competing nations.
The conflict of interest was glaring, but the most difficult task fell to Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck. He was appointed as the supreme commander of the Joint Defense Council, and his job was to physically divide the military, its personnel, and its vast physical assets by April 1948.
And we aren't just talking about drawing lines on a map here. We are talking about dividing regiments that had literally bled together fighting in World War II, suddenly splitting them up based on religion. We're talking about deciding who gets which ships, which tanks, and which aircraft. The sources show they were even dividing office furniture, typewriters, and library books.
The granular level of this division was absurd, and the political friction was unbelievable. Now, it's worth noting here, and we have to be clear, that historical accounts of this specific period are incredibly fractured.
Right.
Depending on whether you're reading British diaries, Indian Congress records, or Muslim League archives, you'll get completely conflicting pictures of Mountbatten's biases and who was allegedly sabotaging whom. We are not taking sides, we are just looking strictly at the mechanics of what happened based on the assessments in the text.
Absolutely. So what did happen?
Well, Indian leaders heavily pressured Auchinleck. They accused him of being pro-Pakistan because he was actively trying to send Pakistan its allocated share of military stores, which were mostly located inside Indian territory.
And the pressure got so intense that Mountbatten eventually forced Auchinleck to resign prematurely in November 1947, months before his deadline. The Joint Defense Council was dissolved, and that effectively halted the transfer of military stores, leaving the newly formed Pakistani army severely under-equipped right as tensions over Kashmir were boiling over.
Exactly. The very mechanism designed to ensure a fair distribution of military power collapsed under the weight of national rivalry.
But one of the more shocking mechanics of this transition is what Auchinleck did right before independence. The sources detail a secret stand-down order. He ordered that if India and Pakistan went to war against each other, all British officers serving in both armies, and there were hundreds of them in high command positions, training the new national armies, they must immediately stand down.
Yes.
They were ordered to actively sabotage war plans and refuse to participate to avoid fighting each other.
Which is exactly what happened when conflict broke out over Kashmir in late 1947. The British officers in command of the Pakistani and Indian forces found themselves paralyzed by these secret, overriding orders from London. They were technically serving independent nations, but answering to a foreign power.
So what does this all mean? If your top military commanders are secretly answering to a foreign capital, and they have standing orders to pack up and sabotage operations if a war starts, can you even say these two new nations were truly 100% sovereign in those early months?
This raises an important question about the reality of independence versus the illusion of it. The paradox of this transition is that the British institutions meant to ensure a smooth, fair handover like Auchinleck's Joint Defense Council were dismantled precisely because the two new nations were already acting as sovereign hostile rivals. But at the exact same time, the sovereignty of those nations was deeply compromised by the British referees who were desperately trying to maintain their Cold War geopolitical goals. The referees became obsolete, exposed, and ultimately paralyzed by their own conflicting loyalties.
It really reframes the whole narrative. Like the end of the British Raj wasn't just a simple, elegant handover of power at the stroke of midnight. It was a rushed, strategically compromised exit.
Very much so.
It was driven by British Cold War calculations. It was executed by completely inexperienced cartographers using outdated tax maps, and it was managed by transitional officers who were caught in an impossible collapsing web of loyalties.
And this matters profoundly for you, the listener, today, because the borders drawn in 5 weeks by Radcliffe, the forced accession of the princely states, the bitter disputes over military assets, these didn't just cause immediate historical tragedy, though, we must always remember the staggering scale of that tragedy. An estimated 400,000 deaths and 12 million people violently displaced from their homes.
The largest mass migration in human history.
Yes. But beyond that immediate horror, those rushed decisions literally locked in the geopolitical tensions of South Asia. The fault lines drawn in August 1947 over Kashmir, over the division of river waters, over tiny border tussles, these are the exact same fault lines that dominate global news today between two nuclear-armed neighbors.
Which brings us back to our skyscraper demolition. The British government decided they needed to bring the building down in 5 minutes rather than 5 months, hoping to quickly salvage the steel beams to build a new Commonwealth defense shield against the Soviets.
But in their desperate haste to engineer regional stability for their own geopolitical ends, they left the foundation in absolute ruins.
Leaving us with the final thought for you to mull over. Considering the decades of conflict that this frantic haste created, did the empire's desperate attempt to engineer regional stability actually end up guaranteeing perpetual instability instead?
A question that the subcontinent is still answering today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.